All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is the domain number 5 for our PCNSE webinar series. The idea with this one, as you've probably heard if you've watched any of the preceding recordings, is really we wanted to take an approach just to prepare in an open manner where you could come join us in these sessions or watch after the fact as we go through our internal PCNSE preparation. So on this screen, I have every single webinar that we've done. We always orient ourselves at least around the PCNSE webpage, which is publicly available from palotonetworks.com. And most often we will be referencing the blueprint and the study guide. And the blueprint is basically just a table of contents output for what the content is on the exam. So today is domain 5, manage and operate. I'm not too sure for the rest of the team if we're going to be looking at some links, documents, or any demo systems, but we'll do that as we need to touch on all of the items currently on the screen. And I'll skip our personal intros because we've done that in previous sessions, and I'm sure if anyone's watching this, they probably watched them in order. And I'll leave it at that. I think the manage and configure log forwarding section 5.1 was going to be the overview is going to be led by you, Jawad, if I'm not mistaken. So I'll stop sharing and I'll hand it over to you, Jawad.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. Good morning again. Gonna share my screen. Yeah, and jump into section 5.1, which talks about log forwarding. So we talked about how big Palo is on visibility, and that starts with basically turning on logging, right? Whether it's traffic logs by turning on logging at session ends on all the policies, or alerting, or even prevention on threat profiles and URL profiles, etc. So that turns on, logging, and you have that visibility that helps with understanding what's going on and troubleshooting all that. Now, taking this to the higher level is forwarding those logs outside just the firewall. So, and there's a lot of use cases for this. One is forwarding logs to Panorama to have that central single pane, for troubleshooting and for reporting, or to Cortex Data Lake. But even outside the Palo Alto products like the Panorama and the Cortex, even forwarding to SIM tools like Splunk or email alerting and other external third-party systems. That's all configured through log forwarding. So looking at the demo box here, this is configured in 2 different places, depending whether it's a log generated by traffic or if it's a system kind of log. So for traffic generated logs under objects, we have log forwarding. And this is where we're going to be configuring all the log forwarding profiles. And then under device tab, we have the log settings. And this is where we configure all the system and config log forwarding. Okay. That's why we have it in 2 different places, basically. So going to the objects, log forwarding, when I add the profile here, so I give it a name, description, and then in here we can basically have rules, and those rules basically will dictate what gets log forwarded to what. So again, we give it a name, and then we choose the log type. These are the different event or log types generated by traffic. Could be simply traffic logs, or threat logs, or URL logs. Decryption logs is another one. URL. So those are the types available. So selecting the type, and then you can choose to forward simply all logs, or even filter out what needs to be forwarded. And this is, yeah, like you can go very granular. You can build filters here based on different criterias or attributes that will help you basically to build those or to choose what to filter on and what to forward. So on. Usually, to Panorama, we're forwarding everything. We're not filtering out, forwarding all logs, all traffic logs, all threat logs, all URL logs. But there are use cases where we want to filter out traffic. For example, if we're forwarding to a SIM like Splunk, mostly we might be forwarding threat logs. If we're email alerting, we might be choosing also picking specific things we want to alert on. Yeah, and that's all doable through the filter. And then this under the forward method is configuring where we want to forward those logs to. So we have 4 different methods here besides the Panorama. So if you want to forward to Panorama, we're just checking this checkbox here. As simple as that. And then if we want to forward to external systems, then we're adding the profile, whether it's SNMP, we create the profile in here. And then we enter the, different parameters for SNMP, like the version, V2 or V3, and then the community password and all the details. If it's a log server, similar, we're entering also the syslog profile information, as well as email profile, HTTP profile. So commonly, we should try to have one log forwarding profile if possible. That simplifies things because I'm going to show how we still have one other step is to attach the log forwarding profile to policy. But again, there might be use cases where we need to have different log forwarding profiles. This built-in action here I think, is newer that they've added. And this basically helps with tagging traffic based on filters and based on log forwarding profile where you're filtering on specific traffic. Then you can basically, based on a destination or a source address or a username, add a tag. And that tag can be referenced through a dynamic address group or a dynamic user group. And basically, based on that tagging, an action could happen. So because those dynamic address groups and user groups are referenced in policies. So for example, let's say you're filtering on threats for sinkhole or for maybe a specific type of vulnerability. And that gets matches with a source address, let's say, or a destination address, maybe one of your critical servers, or maybe a user or a group of users. And you want basically when a threat matches those sources, servers or sources or destinations, then basically you want a specific policy to apply, like quarantine policy, or maybe you want to block this traffic or sinkhole it. And through tagging, basically, you can achieve that. So that's the purpose of this built-in action here.
Right.
So yeah, like after adding, the different rules here for the different types of traffic, you build this profile. So we can look at one like this one default here. They've chose to forward log all logs for traffic, and then specific anything above informational for threats, same for URL, and so on and so forth. So after building that profile, the next step is to add that profile into the policy. So log forwarding is applied at the policy level.
Well, that's opening, Jawad. Is it only one log forwarding profile per rule? You can't have
Yes.
multiple?
Yes,
Right.
it's good point. It's one log forwarding profile per rule. Actually, let me might be faster here.
And so with that case, I think, I know you made a comment earlier, generally, I guess, if customers had Panorama, it's simple to have a log forwarding profile, maybe just one, so you can make sure it's always on all the rules. And then you
Yep.
could be granular at the Panorama level to send these types of logs to your SIM, send these types of logs to a SolarWinds or a network monitoring tool and whatnot.
Yeah, and then there's based on the policies and the traffic, then you
Right,
can attach additional things that are included in
right.
that profile. Yeah, when you add a rule, note that by default, log at session ending, that's the recommended logging that should be turned on for policies. Log at session start is required in some cases when you're doing advanced troubleshooting. You want to see, how application shifts and other things happen. But in most other normal cases, you leave this unchecked. You just log at session, and that's creating the local logging, and then the log forwarding profile is selected down here. The good thing is by default, it chooses the default profile. So this could be your profile forwarding to Panorama. This way you don't forget about it because it's very easy, commonly like creating new rules, you end up forgetting to add that log forwarding profile. But then if you wanted to log differently to that, like send to Splunk, send to other external systems, then you're choosing a different security profile from here.
Yeah, I
So
remember that
yeah,
default trick was one that helped without, so rules wouldn't get added, Jawad, and then
Yeah.
people would not remember to select the log forwarding profile. You were going to
Yep.
say something, Mohammed?
yeah, I was about to on that. That's a good point, Jawad, on the log at session start and log at session end. Just to clarify, you will only see logs in the monitoring tab when a session ends if you have selected log at session end, correct? So especially like traffic like SSH, when people log into SSH and suddenly you go to the monitor tab and you're trying to find out, can I see that SSH traffic?
Yeah.
Technically, you will not be able to see that unless the user logs out of that SSH session, right? So that's a
Right.
misconception that
Yeah.
SSH is not coming through the firewall. Depending on this checkboxes, I believe you will see the appropriate action in the monitor tab.
Yeah. Yeah. You can still see it through the active sessions, but you won't see it
Correct.
in the monitor logs. Yeah, for sure. Until that session ends. Yeah. No, good point. Thanks.
And one other thought that came to mind after you mentioned that too, Mohammed, I know on an earlier session, I think it was you, Paul, that went through talking about App ID and how there's application shifting. And if you need to find out how that application shifting happens, I believe log at session start will allow that visibility, right?
Yeah, Jawad mentioned that actually. If you are doing advanced troubleshooting, looking at application shifting, like Jawad said, yeah, log at session start can help you see that
Right.
shift. Otherwise, you will
Awesome.
only see the capture, and the app ID will only show the log on session and app ID, which might not be all the apps that went through during that session.
Right. Yeah. No, thank you for confirming that, Paul. Last, just more curiosity question. Do you guys know, is that trick Jawad mentioned with default, is that the iron skillet? Is that sort of the recommended profile, logging profile name?
It's a great question, Steph. I don't know if it is the iron skillet
Okay.
one, but it's pretty common. Like the default use for that and profile groups, right?
Right.
For security stuff, they do that too.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think Iron Skillet does use that default.
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, no more questions on this end. Sorry, Jawad.
No, that's good.
Continue.
Last point I want to mention is, yeah, it's if you set up the log forwarding, you're expecting the traffic to be forwarded, and then you don't see it in, let's say, in Panorama or in Splunk. I would come and check here locally to see that traffic, if it's showing up right locally in here. And if it's not, that means then alerting is not turned, as I mentioned before. So you still need to turn on alerting on all your security profiles, and the URL and all of that, so that it's generated so that it can be forwarded to those external systems.
On that point, Jawad, there's a threat around zone protection that requires a zone protection log set as well, right?
Yeah, good point.
And that's one that I know is commonly misunderstood.
Yeah.
There is a log enabled under zones.
Yeah,
and
and the
this is
zone
commonly
protection. Yeah, totally good. Yeah, good point. You have also to add that log forwarding profile in there, in the zone
itself.
actually.
Yeah,
in the zone
And
itself.
I don't think I even recalled seeing that on the study guide. Did you guys see that anywhere on the study guide?
I don't know.
It's very relevant.
People before.
Yeah, it's very, yeah, definitely not in the study guide. I haven't seen it, but based on what we've seen in the previous experiences, yeah.
And again, back to that default, that will save you. Like if you have that default, then it's otherwise, yeah, you have to come here and add that profile.
It's the same logging profile. The rationale, just to rationalize a little bit for Palo Alto's sake, is because the stuff doesn't, like the stuff that hits zone protection profile and buffers don't actually get to the state where it gets to the policy, right? So like you could actually deny traffic at the zone level on the interface because of zone protection. Previous to when it hits the log policies. So it won't know what log policy to hit. So you have to apply it to the zone because it's so soon
Early
in the exchange. Yeah, so early in the exchange.
Yep. So yeah, that was basically traffic log forwarding. Now talking about system and config logs. So anything generated outside traffic will be configured under device log settings. And very similar, so you have system logs, configuration logs, user ID logs, HIP logs, global protect, IP tags, and then you can do some alarm settings as well from here. So yeah, similarly, you click add on each profile and then give it a name and choose what you want to filter on, and then choose the forward method. Very commonly for system logs, I see a lot of clients do email alerting, for example, on critical system logs. If an HA event happened or anything was critical or high system event related to the firewall, they want to be notified, for example, by email. And then you can forward also SNMP and syslog, as well as HTTP. And again, configuration logs, user ID, same settings. Besides, of course, forwarding to Panorama as well, which is the same checkbox we saw in the other profile. Some of those also, like the user ID, would have that built-in action I mentioned there. System and config logs don't have it for obvious reasons. But user ID, you can also configure built-in actions as well in those profiles. Then no comments or questions on this one. I'll move to the last part here related to this would be under management tab, logging and reporting settings. That's where we're gonna basically set or configure different things related to logging and storage. So under log storage, we've got the quota. So this is where you basically allocate a percentage of your storage, available storage, to the different log types. Traffic logs take the most, basically. So usually they're given the highest allocation. And then threat logs would be second, and then config systems such as that. If you go above 100%, it will start basically decreasing. It won't allow you basically to go above 100%. So make sure the allocation is within the 100%. And then that will show you the quota NGP next to it. And then you can define maximum days of retention. But that's going to be the limitation. There's going to be how much the firewall anyways have storage with. So if it's less than the maximum days you assign here, then it's going to start deleting the old logs and overriding those.
Right.
Yeah, so we've got all the different traffic allocations here, as well as for reporting, and then some settings here related as well to maximum rows in CSV file when you export, for example, from traffic or threat logs. You can change that if you need to have more, rows in there. How many backup files or config audit files versions it's gonna hold, and things like that are configured in here. And then predefined reports, by default, it checks on everything, but you can also customize what to have in predefined reports. If for any reason you need to free up some space, this could be one option here.
Actually, on that point, Joy, I think that was one of the recommendations is in like CPU consumption. If you're having issues with management
CPU.
playing CPU,
Yeah.
they actually say to turn some of these off because
Yep.
they're randomly consuming CPU cycles to generate on those.
Right. And those predefined reports by default, they just run every 24 hours, like they're a daily run, are they?
Yeah.
Honestly, it's a great question, Steph. Is it every 24
I
hours?
think, yeah. This would be.
Just recall, yeah, they have
Yeah,
them
and
all
you
there.
can go back. I don't know how much. Yeah, you can go back number of days there, and yeah, it runs every 24 hours. Those are all the custom or the predefined reports, basically. Yeah, I think that's all that I had in this section. Hopefully, I didn't miss anything.
No, I think that was good, Jawad. Yeah. Any questions on the managing configure log porting that you guys had? So we could jump to the next section.
No question. Yeah, that was good, Jawad. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. I think the next one you're going to walk us through, Nathaniel. If I'm not mistaken, the next section was plan and execute the process to upgrade a Palo Alto network system. Sounds
Yes.
super fancy.
It does. I'll share my screen out here.
Sounds good.
So yeah, before we start the section, I will say it's quite light compared to what I was expecting. It actually doesn't talk about the process for upgrading the firewalls, even though that's what it says it's about.
Yeah.
So I'm going to leverage some of the other resources that Palo Alto provides outside of this document. And we can talk about, just go step by step through that. I have the firewall open, and then we can just sort of look at what that would look like if you were to do that. So yeah, let's just quickly talk about what is in here. So this section, first of all, it talks about single firewalls, and this single firewall section, it only talks about the single pass software or architecture, as Palo Alto calls it.
Yeah.
You would expect that it would say, okay, this is how you upgrade it, but it's not the case. Anyway, single pass software, instead of running a pass for each type of process that the firewall does on a packet, it does it all in a single pass. And that's basically the main understanding. There's more to it, of course, but I believe this is
or something.
Yeah, I believe this is touched upon elsewhere in this study guide, so we're not going to focus on that. Same with high availability. There's a section on high availability right after this, so I'll leave that to Paul.
Yeah.
But the main thing that we care about is upgrading firewalls in HA clusters, single firewalls, and under Panorama, as well as dynamic updates. So I will point everyone towards this document here. So there is a document usually once per major release that Palo Alto does. This one's 10.1. It's just a good reference. It has a document for the process of upgrading a standalone and an HA firewall. The demo box that I have here doesn't have HA, so we'll just focus on standalone and then briefly touch on HA afterwards. So starting off, and I don't know, you guys might know because I haven't done the exam. Is this process stuff part of the exam historically, or is it not touched on so much?
Well, answer in a way that will
Yeah.
respect the exam.
Of course.
Like it's all we know it's multiple choice, and knowing the types of questions that are on the exam, it may ask, like, as we all know, even looking at the sample questions, sometimes the questions are, do you know the syntax? Do you know the command? Or what is the most correct answer? I
Right.
don't think I've in some Cisco exams that I've completed before, it's more advanced than drop down. It's sometimes drag over and arrange in order and
Gotcha.
that type of stuff. And based on the exam overview document we looked at on, I think on the very first session, this exam doesn't have any of those components. So if that helps answer the question, Nathaniel, I don't think people could expect to see something more than a multiple choice one-liner question.
Okay.
PCNSE exam.
Either way, I still say this is worthwhile
Still
to touch
very
on.
relevant.
It's
Yeah,
very
still
relevant,
on
and
this.
It's
yeah,
super relevant.
It's very
And-
important.
and I-
So
Yeah, and I will caveat what I said is I could be completely wrong because I haven't written the new version
Of course.
the exam. Just
Yeah.
as a disclaimer.
yeah, I don't think
Yeah.
any of us have. So, or
Yeah.
maybe Jawad. But anyway, yeah. So we'll just
Say the
quickly
next
touch
one.
on this. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that where you were, yeah.
this document covers the best practice process for making sure your upgrades go smoothly. So
Yeah.
Of course, first things first is making sure all of your configs are backed up. Make sure that you have everything you need in case something does go wrong with the upgrade. The firewall doesn't boot back up correctly, and then you can recover as quickly as possible. So first things first is saving and exporting a configuration snapshot, as well as I like to do a running config, and I believe that's what it says as well. Pretty much just into setup operations, and then you can do both of those operations here. Export name configuration. So once you've done that, the user. So yeah, the step 2, it talks about user ID. It clears the current IP address to username associations, and then it will rebuild those after the update. So you can estimate the time this would take using these commands. I don't do this personally because the upgrade usually needs to be done, and it's going to take as much time as it's going to take. Although this will give you, if it is time sensitive, this will give you a good idea about any extra time that might need for that. So next off, and this is part of this section, it's dynamic updates.
Mhm.
So before the upgrade, it is recommended to ensure that your dynamic updates, antivirus, app and threat, wildfire, all those are up to date. So you can just come into the device and then the dynamic updates page, and you can see all of those here. So these are set up on this firewall, at least to upgrade on a schedule. These can be done manually, of course. You can download and install updates as you wish, but most firewalls are set up on a schedule. And in this case, it's a daily schedule. Every day at 3 o'clock, it'll download and install the latest version. If you are running a peer, an HA pair, you can check this to make sure that both devices are always on the same version and they're always downloaded together. Yeah, so you can come in here, press check now. This will pull the latest information from Palo's side, and then you can check and make sure you're on the latest version. In this case, this firewall would not be, although in some cases the schedule is set up to have a threshold. So in this case, it just hasn't probably checked since it's not 3 o'clock. But you can say, additionally to that, you can say, I don't want to upgrade these until the update is at least 24 hours old. And then you can set even more additional for new app IDs. You can say 48 hours, for example. I believe that's the best practice, is setting 24 hours here and 48 hours for new app IDs. And pretty much this is just in case any issues with the updates show up. Usually it's caught within the 24 hours, and then Palo Alto will push out either a fixed version or won't push it at all. They'll sort of change it. And this sort of protects you from having any unnecessary like app ID associations that might not be right. If a new app ID comes out, it might cause false positives. It just happened in the past. And then this will make sure that you're sort of protected. So once you're on the latest version, you can pretty much just go to the software tab. And I believe it doesn't, I don't think it says it here, but in the HA upgrade, it also recommends you go to the support tab and export a tech support download or generate and download a tech support file from the device you're doing the upgrade on. This is just, sorry, Paul?
The one just above that. Yeah, tech support's the one above.
Yeah. Yeah. So that, yeah, stats dump tech support. And I believe this is just so that in the event of a failure, it has all the information about the firewall so that can be identified. And I guess also you can, this includes all the configs on the firewall, so you can recreate stuff as necessary in the event of something goes wrong. So yeah, moving on. Once you're all backed up, once you're updated, dynamic updates wise, you can come to the software page, check for new software, and then upgrade to your desired version. I will show off this page as well for the, I guess, best practice preferred release for the firewalls. So there's this forum post in the Palo Alto Networks live community that is updated frequently. This tells you for each PAN-OS version, as well as Global Protect and some other software pieces, it tells you which version is currently preferred for each major release. So, for example, 10.0 is past its end of life, so it's not recommended to be there anymore. But for 10.1, 10.2, and 11, it has preferred releases. You can see by the P there, it says preferred release. So 10.1.9 H1, that's probably what you'd want to go to if you're on 10.1, and so on. So this is a very useful page, and I don't know if I guess if there's anyone in chat, I'll post this link, but I don't think there is. So so I'll just leave it. Okay.
It's good we got a visual, and I know
for sure.
The docs are not, you don't need a login, right? But for the live community, you need a login for that page. So just as a heads up to people. Yep.
Excellent. Yeah, so in here, for example, we can find 10.1.9 H1. And then obviously this is the demo box, so we can't do any upgrades with this account, but there would be an action here, either download, install. Once you press the install button, it'll sort of go through the process of the install and then ask you to reboot the device. As well as HA pair, you have the option to sync the download to the other device as well. Best practice for HA devices is to upgrade the primary firewall first, then do the secondary. And obviously there's some additional steps like failing over the primary firewall, disabling it for HA in order to make sure the secondary is active before you obviously reboot the firewall. It obviously saves time because there's no downtime. If you have a very critical operation going, then you might want to consider that. But otherwise, there will be some downtime. So prepare accordingly.
And very important for HA to do it in lockstep. So if you're going more than one major, let's say you're going from 9.1 to 10.1. So yeah, you go to 10.0 first on the first one, then fail over, and go to 10.0 on the second one. Otherwise, you're gonna lose the HA. It's gonna break the HA. if you
Yeah.
go too major
If you
releases.
jump
at a
too
time.
far.
If you
Good
jump
point.
too far.
Right.
Yeah, behind.
Good point. Yeah. As well. Yeah. So going, yeah. So on top of that, so yeah, for example, going from 10 to 10.1, you can't simply, or for example, 9.1 to 10.1, you can't. There's an upgrade path, so you can't simply go from 9.1.6, for example, to 10.1.6. You'd have to follow the upgrade path per se, which also is included on this same page. You
Right.
can say 9.1x can go to, if you're on 9.1x and you want to go to 10.1, you would have to download Pan OS 10, download the latest preferred 10.0 maintenance release, then go to 10.1. So for the HA pair, you would upgrade one to 10, the other to 10, get the maintenance release on both, then finally you can go to 10.1, and then continuing on from that, you can upgrade your patches to that version. So besides that, I think that is the majority of this section. So
Awesome.
does anyone else have anything on top of that? I think I probably got everything.
I think you
I
did.
think you did a great job, Nathaniel.
Yeah. And I'm glad I wasn't the only one that read that study guide and went, this doesn't make any sense of why this is here. It's not that it's not true, but it's like, why is it in this heading? I was
Yeah.
completely lost. So it might be like you said, Paul, it might have actually just been a document mistake because
Like they put section 3.21 and 5.21 or something. Like it does feel a little out of place for sure.
or someone was trying to deflect, just like some politicians do once in a while. Tell me about upgrades. Single pass. Yeah, it's really great,
Yeah.
and you'll like it.
Well, it's
Yeah,
better
so
that
if-
it will go down for potentially an hour or like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, that is a good question, Nathaniel. Do we collectively have an idea of how long these upgrade paths will take, especially with a single firewall that becomes most impactful?
It really depends on the model. So obviously a higher power model will have the capabilities to bring everything up a lot faster afterwards. So you got to take that into consideration as you're deciding on what firewall to buy. That's a big one. So for example, if you decide that you only need one, but you still want to have a short upgrade time, then consider the higher power firewalls. Obviously, if you have a pair, then that's less of a concern. But obviously, it's not something that is set in stone. It's not something that we can define just because each firewall is set up differently. It has different services that it has to bring up and down as it does the upgrades.
Totally fair point, Nathaniel. Yeah, and to add to that, like very good point. The firewall version makes a big difference. Like we've seen some very slow performances on some of the older hardware, like the PA200s back in the day, not so readily out there anymore, but they used to take quite a while to do upgrades. And the PNOS versions themselves, sometimes during that step, they need to do things like convert log databases over, and it can be down for quite a while to do that. So I'm sure you guys have all had some some nightmare stories on that. So yeah, plan accordingly, like you said earlier, Nathaniel. Like maybe this is an after hours thing, and if it's an HA cluster, you can get away with a lot more because you can actively fail over.
Yeah, and check for any issues related to specifically your model of firewall with the desired version, because
before you go,
there's been a history of certain versions not mixing well with the firewall models. So the upgrade can be fast for one model, even 90% of the models that Palo Alto has, but then there's one specific firewall that it takes extra long for.
Very good point, Nathaniel. And that I think is a really good section because people are going to manage that issue a lot. Like they're going to manage upgrading firewalls often, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. So I want to talk about, well, I don't want to talk about, I'm going to talk about manage HA functions. So
you want to, Paul. You've been waiting all day to talk about
all day.
HA.
I'm very excited for it. Yeah. So we've already touched on HA configuration previously, but I'm going to do a quick overview of it just so we're all on the same page before I go through like the manage stuff. There's active, passive. Typically, you know, one's available, and as Nathaniel said, it fails over according to some things we're going to look at here on how it fails over and managing the failover. But that's what it means. It's so you have a, you know, availability. There's also a concept that I had to learn, guys, and this is maybe because my PCNSE might be a little older, is clusters, right? So there's active, and active passive clusters, and then there's also a new concept of an HA4 link, which allows sessions to be distributed amongst a cluster of firewalls. So when you think about something like a horizontally scaling environment where you have VM300s across in a group, HA4 allows you to balance between those cluster devices in a cluster. Awesome. So really quickly, I'm going to go through some of this, and then I think I probably need some help to go through, make sure I'm catching all this stuff, guys. But
one question, I'll interrupt you if it's okay, Paul, is
absolutely.
just on that clustering. I'll maybe share the previous, I think like the last time I'd written the PCNSE, they had talked about clustering. I had my own suspicions that was some rare requirement, or maybe came from like the cloud architecture of the day. But really, I had never, ever seen it in real life. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the clustering HA deployed with Palo Alto, where there's like 4, 5, 6, 7 firewalls in a cluster.
Yeah, pairs in a cluster. Or standbys.
There are quantities of pairs.
Or standby. You can have active, passive, and standby single units in a cluster.
Yeah.
And there's different types of clustering too.
Yeah, so that'll be interesting to see what's actually, you know, applicable to the exam, because I recall the previous study guide actually had like a section on clustering, but when I read through this, they just sort of also mentioned it, like supports up to, and didn't go into great detail. So no, that other info you provided was awesome, Paul. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll jump into it. So the stuff that I'm more familiar with is the active passive, the HA1, HA2, HA3 links.
Yeah.
So let's talk about managing that. So yeah, so they go right into HA links. So there's different links for different use cases. HA1 links is mostly for control link. It's the management synchronization of policy and management functions. Data link is when you're going to get all of your sort of session synchronization through, and it's a higher bandwidth link that's typically dedicated for data itself. If you're in an active state, that also could mean that you're passing traffic into the other session to do session startup and stuff, or redirect that way. So dedicated HA ports on some models are there, obviously. And the higher models, there's dedicated HA1, HA2 ports. And then HA3 is only for packet forwarding. So HA2 is for data link, that's synchronization. And then HA3 is for packet forwarding if it's required. And again, these are on higher models that are doing mostly like active packet forwarding, right? There's also now an HA4 link. We'll talk about that because that's where it comes into cluster control, I guess. So HA1, again, this is what's going to be most important, I think, is HA1 is going to be for config sync, basically, and management functionality. And HA2 is going to be for data synchronization. And that's all the other things that synchronize that are database, not config-based. So the configuration synchronization HA pair, you can see under control plane synchronization over HA1 link. This is an article. I'm going to go through a bunch of different articles here. Just found that most valuable for this section. Control plane synchronization over HA1 link is configuration. So configuration changes to either active or passive units as they synchronize to peer. Certificates, tab synchronizations like policies, objects, network. Again, all the configuration. You can see underneath HA2, we're talking about things like session states, IPsec MAC tables, neighbor discovery, IP4, right? ARP tables, data. That's on the box. So active state being linked. And then there's objects that are not synchronized. There are some things that stay on the boxes themselves, you know, web certificates, log links, and they talk about this. And then some network specific parameters, such as link speed and duplexes, they don't actually synchronize at all. You can see what things are there and force them by way of configuration commands here, or way of CLI commands. Prerequisites for setting up an HA pair. We may have talked about some of this already. You know, same model, same PAN-OS version to the point of jumping too many ahead in an update. You will break the HA pair, and then you will basically have 2 standalone devices you need to deal with, which is not what you want when it's HA pair. So you have to stay lockstep, as Jawad and Nathaniel mentioned earlier. And the other one that I forgot is same set of licenses too. So licenses are unique, but they must be the same because they can't have the same functionality or HA pair configuration if you're missing licenses. There's more licenses now than there has been in the past because there's more features from Palo that's been released. So I think this is even more interesting. And I don't know if you guys know, maybe it's a question back to the group. Some licenses, is it all licenses truly, or is there some licenses that don't need to be paired? Like I know in the past it was things like if you have a GlobalProtect gateway license, that does need to be on both. Obviously antivirus, protections, things like that. The license itself being the support model, but there's so many new licenses now. I'm wondering if this still holds true to all licenses that are out there. Thinking like data lake licenses, when you do the free license for SSL decrypt forwarding, does that need to be the same on both? Honestly, I'm not
Good
sure.
question.
So, but it does say same set of licenses. So like I'm, you don't know, I guess it's just all of it.
Yeah.
They say licensed identically or it can't be synchronized. That's all I got from it. Awesome. So we went over HA links. Oh, actually, they do a great job here for this. Oh, default port communications. Very interesting, actually, to understand the difference there because they're totally random high-level port. So if you see it show up in your environment, it's good to know where they're coming from. Yeah, too much into that. Data packet forwarding. And then HA4 link, which I couldn't find in the actual original documentation under setup of active pairs. But this is the session cache synchronization for HA cluster members to make sure they have the same ID for that session, and that's how they organize their sessions into the cluster. Okay, failover. You actually just skip a little bit. So here's a pretty common active, passive HA1, HA2 link. You don't need HA3 and HA4 if you're not using them, right? HA3 again for session forwarding. If you're not doing session forwarding because you're not an active actor or anything, you don't need it. And HA4 if you're not doing clustering, you don't need it. So let's say these two boxes have dedicated or assigned HA1, HA2 links. This is what it would look like. So how does failover kind of occur? Well, it talks through setting up ping as a backup to heartbeat communication. So HA1 link, if it fails, we'll try to do HA1 backup link, right? Actually, we should look at these links. Okay, I want to show these links and you guys will have to correct me if I go wrong here. HA, high availability is something that you configure and hopefully don't have to manage too often, but it's good to understand how that operates. So there is HA1 and then HA1 backup, and then there's HA2. And I don't believe there's an HA2 backup functionality. And Jawad, you might be Steph, yes?
I think,
Yes, there is.
yeah, I
Thank you,
think
guys.
you can just make all of them redundant effectively if you want to, you know, like a cable does, or if they're using a switch to connect the firewall HAs together, you can build resiliency in there.
Perfect. Okay. So I'll let you guys correct me as I go through it. So HA1, if it's a dedicated link and you're doing backup, you could do it. Basically, it's a heartbeat ping, right? And that can be done with a management plane as a ping to their device's IP, or it can be done in another HA1 dedicated link that you assign as a backup, right? And it's probably very similar to HA2. Is that fair, guys? So it's to control the failure of a single link causing the failure of the high availability causing failover.
That is correct.
Yes.
Yeah, HA1 backup is highly recommended. This is where you will run into a split brain situation. And once you run into split brain, then that is the problem, right? You will encounter network outages. So it is highly recommended to have HA1 backup link. On HA2 is more on session synchronization. It's not the end of the world if your primary HA2 backup, HA2 link goes down. It's still you're not going to run into network outages.
But in the event of a failure, you might not have that.
Exactly. The sessions will not be synchronized. The new sessions on the recently active firewall have to be rebuilt. So that is the only caveat. But HA1 on a smaller firewall, you will use your management port as HA1 backup versus on the higher end models, you will literally have dedicated ports HA1A and HA1B as your backup link.
Right.
And just to define split brain scenario, thank you, Mohammed, is when both firewalls think they're both active at the same time because they don't see their peers, so they don't know that they're a passive unit, and so they both try to act as your firewall, causing all kinds of issues with routing and things.
Yeah, the network freaks out. What's going on?
Awesome. Thank you, Mohammed. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, no worries.
Awesome. Oh, HA1 is also called control link, right? I probably forgot to do that. Okay. So heartbeat polling and hello messages. We talked about that. Link monitoring. Actually, I don't know if we did talk about link monitoring. Let's cluster. Hold on, guys. I wanted to just show the. Sorry, guys. Okay, this is all. I was hoping to show the link state monitoring, but that's okay. And because the demo devices are VMs with not in a cluster, I'm not able to show HA really. But that's okay. Talk about active passive. Not too worried about that. Any questions actually on active passive or anything that you guys want to add that I missed? Managing it, you got to understand the floating IP space with active. I mean, that is something that comes up when you're managing it. And active passive is mostly just understanding which one's active at the same time, or which one's active at that time.
One question I'll throw out. So yeah, and I know you mentioned it, Paul, like they refer to like link monitoring, but it's actually link state monitoring. Like if the port's up, good. If it's down, that's a failure condition. And if I recall from a long time ago, you can say the failure condition is 1 or it's a group, and sort of define that. But on the path monitoring, which is more, is this destination reachable? I'm curious to know if you guys have seen that parameter be configured, and any guidelines around the path monitoring, or if most people just do link monitoring.
I've seen path monitoring come into play in most cases where there are dual ISPs. For example, link monitoring, as you were saying, it only detects a failure of a link. In an instance where you have an internet edge switch, your polos are connected to the switch, ISP1 goes down, however, your firewall link state is still up, so it still will continue to send traffic over to your ISP1, but that is down. So in that case, you want to set up path monitoring to ISP1. If that path monitoring detects that, hey, I cannot get to ISP1, then the firewall fail over to ISP-B. So this is where I've seen where the use case will be for path monitoring, where you cannot completely rely on just your link states.
Right. And you don't want to monitor too far out, then it's sort of like still the next top path.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. Okay. That makes sense.
Awesome. Thank you, Mohammed. Yeah. And I mean, they do have this. We can look at this here. So link monitoring is just up, down status of the link. And then path monitoring, if you enable that, you need to configure path groups and then what that failure condition is in order to fail over.
Right.
Thank you, Mohammed. Awesome. Okay, that's active, passive. I want to get into a little bit of the clustering stuff because this is something that was really definitely new for me. Okay, so when you're managing an active, there's more involved in managing an active because this section is about managing specifically, not configuring, which I think Mohammed did a great job before. So active passive, typically it's a little bit easier to manage, right? That's why the section's so small here. Active though, understanding what interface owns what IP and the floating of that interface is important. And that's where they talk about in this diagram here is that the HA pair creates a virtual MAC address for each of the interfaces that has a floating IP on it, and it basically does ARP load sharing of that IP address. That's how it handles this in a networking component where both can be active at the same time. There is more involved in managing an active pair, which is one of the reasons we see more limited use of active is there's just more involved, there's complication to the environment, and because of that, potentially more things you need to know and deal with and solve. So, but for testing purposes, it's definitely one of those sections they might just talk about.
Yeah, that's a good point you raised, Paul, because I mean, if someone's newer to Palo Alto and maybe a lot more experience with like Checkpoint, it is a bit different. Like I know Checkpoint has a cluster IP in their active passive and then 2 real IPs and 2 MACs, but in an active passive pair with Palo Alto, it is a single IP, which is a bit different than other vendors. And then you're getting into, yes, the active is yet another variation of that. So yeah, that's good. That's good to highlight. We assume that as we spent a lot of time with Palo Alto that some others might be used to other firewall HA methods.
Absolutely. And then finally clustering. So yeah, managing the links is just knowing when they're up, when they're down, so that you know when they're going to fail over. We're talking failover at the end here. And then clustering is actually, let's just jump to failover really quick. So the failover scenarios. How does the device actually fail over? Well, it detects that the HA1 link is broken, and the backup is also broken. It knows that it can't detect its peer. It takes over the active state. That's in an active passive cluster. In an active cluster, the other device just goes down. It doesn't care about it because the other one's taking all the traffic, so all the traffic ends up going to that device. In an active passive, you do have this failover situation occur. So yeah, link monitoring, if any of the links are down or all the links are down, it depends on your group settings, basically. The path monitoring detects that it's out, even though the link state is up, as Mohammed mentioned, it could cause that failure. And then the backup is also used. So if it can't ping the other device, basically, if it can't see that the other device is active and working, it will take over. That's kind of how that works. And you can force a device to leave a cluster through management of the cluster. So you go to high availability and you say, suspend from the cluster, or sort of suspend from the pair, and it will not take over even if there's a failure. So obviously, if you're doing upgrades, you're trying to force a failure, you can suspend that device from basically returning results to the other side so that it knows that it's down, and then it will fail over. And then you can resume it the same button, basically. And yeah, that's failover. So really quick over clusters, because this is very, very new for me. But the idea is that from what I'm understanding, and everyone can correct me, I'd love for you guys to correct me on this. From what I'm understanding, they basically tag or ID every session that comes into the session table. And that session table can be shared through this cluster, this HA4 link, so that all devices know that the active sessions are. And that way, when a new session shows up, and it actually should be the same deterministic ID as the session that exists, it will go to the right firewall so that the session stays persistent on the firewall that's handling that session, rather than having a broken session because it's not going to the same device. So apparently that can be done with any number of groupings of pairs or standalone devices, active, passive, or standalone devices. And this just allows that session to always end up deterministically at the firewall that's handling that session. This was a problem in the past. People dealt with in the cloud through horizontal scaling. They dealt with like ECMP and all kinds of things to manage this. Front-end load balancers, right? ELBs or some other construct that handles session synchronization for you, so that when you pass it to the firewall, you pass it deterministically to the same firewall. And to your point earlier, Steph, I think this came from mostly cloud deployments. I think when you're deploying scale sets or groups of these virtual machines in a workload or workload group, they need to make sure that the session is deterministic to the same virtual machine. And again, this was normally done by an alternate outside device, like an ALB or an NLB, that would deterministically, based on the 5 tuple, send it the same way. Or sounds like Palo has an alternate option now, which is great. It's timely because I'm going to be doing some stuff hopefully in that area soon. So this is two different session distributions. The first one is an a layer 2 HA4 connection. And then this one shows a session distribution, which is a layer 3 sort of cluster, as I understand. So they do have a lot of more explanation here. This is a new concept. Typically, what I've seen is new concepts like to be focal points. So it's good to make sure we're up to date on these things before going into any sort of examination. I'm not yet. So what I'm understanding, basically, when cluster members share a session state, right? And that's how they keep it deterministic to each one. I don't fully understand what happens when there's a failure, like when the session state goes to the wrong one, or who's controlling where that flow goes. But it sounds like it enters this session controller and then it goes there, whether that's a layer 2 construct and everyone gets it, and then the one who knows that session starts to handle that session. If no one knows it, they probably signal that they're taking that session, and they have that session from that point on. I can see that working in a layer 2 scenario. In a layer 3 scenario, I'm assuming there's some sort of construct where they're routing between each other on that same layer 3 interface, and they're telling each other that I'm handling the session, I'm not handling the session actively. So yeah, anything to add to that, guys?
Nothing other than I definitely feel I need to better understand this before I go write the exam, Paul, because I'm still at a loss of like how what the clusters look like. Like, do they have totally separate? It seems like they can be like this cluster pair is active active. This one's active passive. They presumably can have different interface configuration as well. And I hit one page, which I could put the link in for you, Paul, which said this deployment is not supported in public clouds, which leaves me to only be more curious. Now that was on a 10.1 and I can paste it in, but yeah,
Please
I guess
do.
I'm just sharing my curiosity and lack of knowledge is
Where this is
significant
getting
in this
deployed.
domain.
I feel the same, and I'm sorry guys on that, but don't have a lot of time to prepare for this. I don't know where it would be accurate then, but it's to solve a horizontal scaling problem, but the only horizontal scaling problem that I know is typically in cloud deployments.
Agreed.
So if others know of horizontal scaling environments that use this, like on-prem horizontal scaling environments, awesome. This is exactly what someone needed it, I guess, is why I got developed.
Yeah, exactly. It had there's a why, but the details around that, it sounds like, and maybe others are in the same boat, Paul. Like, this might be very uncommon, so it might be just worth doing some extra educational prep for this to prepare for the exam. And I did put that link in, Paul, which at the very bottom, right before was this helpful, which is sort of funny, but it just has a statement, it's not supported in public cloud deployment. So yeah, it's I guess for anyone else out there that might watch this and have some experience actually deploying it, you should reach out to us.
Or let us know, yeah.
Yeah, right below the table, HA clustering is not supported in public cloud deployment. So
very interesting. Okay, so
yeah,
in public cloud, there's still going to be front-ending other deterministic session controlling things like ALPs or NLPs. Yeah, this is
maybe a question for you, Paul. I'm going to wander a bit, but in those network or application load balance deployment models in the cloud, those are really standalone firewalls, right? Like, they don't really know or care how many other Palo Alto firewalls are in that cluster because the load balancer's handling moving traffic across, right? So
correct.
Yeah.
Okay. There are ways to do, and I have done active and active passive in the cloud. There are ways to do it. Depends on the cloud you're dealing with.
Right.
I don't think it's very consistent with how cloud operate though. So something like a cluster is a much better concept for the cloud, where that's how the cloud is being developed in that manner. But yeah, you can do active passive. Done it in Azure, done it in Oracle Cloud. Done active passive in there, and yeah, it's very typical to what you see otherwise. There's extra like plugins, ways to fail over the IPs and stuff that happen in the cloud different than on-prem, but generally it's traffic goes this way. Once it detects those failures at the HA links, same thing there. It fails the different way. That failure just occurs through like API calls.
And one other thing, just because I was poking around, just this is super interesting. There might be other network architectures. Like, there was a reference I saw, Paul, that said how Palo Alto HA clustering can integrate into the Cisco Nexus Intelligent Traffic Director and other things. So this might be even more of an integration feature too with other network architectures too. That just haven't had a chance to have exposure to yet.
I haven't dealt with this particular horizontal scaling use case. Except in public cloud. So anyway,
super interesting.
That is one thing to know how to manage an HA4 link and session distribution, or consistent session distribution if you're managing the firewalls in a cluster. Hopefully it's not very frequent for everyone, or if it is, you'll know exactly what you're talking about there, and I don't. But yeah, that's managing HA. I don't have anything else. If you guys want me to go anywhere else, I'm happy to.
I think I'm good. Yeah, I'll do a quick pause and see if anyone else had any questions.
No, we
that's
covered
that
it
was
well,
the
Paul.
clustering.
Thanks.
Yeah, you sure did, Paul.
To the best of my ability.
Excellent.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah,
But
no,
yeah, that's managing.
that's that. I like, and I know some things you did on the fly there, Paul, which is awesome. Kudos
Yeah.
to you on sort of discovering and answering those
Mhm.
questions. It's always a pleasure syncing up with you guys on these. I always learn something. I really value that. So thanks for taking the time. Let's break. Have a good rest of the day, everyone, and we'll reconvene on the final session, domain of the PCNSE exam on the next session. So until then, we'll talk to you guys later.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.